Yep, and we're live. Hi, everyone, and welcome to our discussion of Old Kiln. And the usual suspects, Roz and I, and we will soon be joined by staff from Sinoist Books, who are the publishers for Old Kiln, and that is Daniel and David. We'll let them introduce themselves when they join. For now, in case you're new, just a reminder, I'm Katya from Page Turners with Katya, and I co-host Reading the Globe for contemporary books with Roz from Scallydandling About the Books. So I'll just very quickly look to see if I've got. Did you read the physical book or did you read an ebook?
I read an ebook, partly because this is a long book, and I'm not great at holding big fat books. That sounds a bit pathetic, doesn't it? But if it's a really chunky thing, then I'll go for the ebook. So it's because I always like to have the book I'm reading with me wherever I go, and that's easier when it's not a brick.
Same thing. So we've got Daniel and David just about to join us. I'll just add them to the stage, so to speak. There we go. Hi.
Hi.
Hi. Welcome. So we've just done our own introductions. I mean, most people who sort of like stumble across live might not know who we are, but most people who join do. But if we could ask you to introduce yourselves, that would be lovely. Daniel, do you want to start?
Certainly. Thank you very much for this opportunity to speak to your audience. My name is Daniel. I work for a small West Sussex-based independent press called Sinoist Books. We are based in Horsham, which is like halfway between London and Brighton, if you know that part of the country. And we specialize in translating translation.
Sorry, Daniel, you've got quite a bit of feedback.
Is this a little bit better?
Tiny bit, but it's still there's a bit of reverb.
Apologies. I have it right next to my laptop, that's why. But is this slightly better now?
It was for like a second and then not.
Okay.
Are you on two devices?
No, but tell you what, why don't I go and download the app, and then I will if you can just turn off the channel.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, shall I have a go?
Yes, please, David, go ahead.
Okay. Can you hear me all right?
Yep, all good.
Good. Okay, I'm David Lammie. I'm one of the editors at Sinoist Books. ACA Publishing has different imprints. Sinoist is the fiction imprint, and I've been working on its titles for about 5 years now. So that is my role here. The book we're discussing today is by Jia Pingwa. I think this is the fourth book that we've published. It's certainly the fourth book I've been involved with. There may be others, but this is his fourth title I've worked on. I think we published earlier this year. I stopped working on it last year, so some of the details of the plot and what have you are probably forgotten to time, but it's a book that really stayed with me, and it's a real favourite of mine, so I'm very happy to be here.
That's wonderful. So very briefly, I am going to let you know that when you say that it stuck with you, but you might, it's been a year, I am actually at 75%. So I'll just very quickly, ask people, because the people now Discord, Roz is the only person who's finished it within the month that we were given, because it was our longest book in the project. We read a contemporary book a month, and we were going to be ambitious with this one. But yeah, 75%. So I've just reached part 5, which is called Winter. And anyone who's currently reading this book, you can let us know in the comments what percent you're at. There's various percentage mentioned on Discord, but yeah, Roz has read full through.
Okay, so no spoilers.
Well, we all gave a little celebration hats in the Discord forum. It was like, wow, fantastic.
Yeah. Yes, I said, we need to bring out the bunting because, I've I've got to the end. Not that it was a struggle to get to the end, because it's a really rewarding and, as you say, really memorable book. But it is. It's a chunkster, let's be honest. So no point in pretending otherwise.
Like you say, I've reached 75% and I'm at the part that says winter, and I was like, oh no, I've got, like I've got no time to finish this before the live, and it's really ratcheted up. So there is just so much going on in the village. I didn't want to put it down, but there we go. So Tilly has said she's at nearly 30%, which again it doesn't sound like much when we say percent, but it is actually in terms of page count.
500 pages or something is about. Yeah, but I'm just I can see Daniel's back, and we should have another go with him introducing himself. But I hadn't realized that you're based in Horsham, because I'm actually in Brighton, so you're just up the road from me.
It's funny how small the world is sometimes.
Yeah, and 3 cheers for good things happening in Sussex. And you are now crystal clear, Daniel. I don't know what you've done, but yeah.
Fantastic. Well, I think David pretty much covered all the points. I mean, the only thing I really have to add in terms of who we are is we do about 10 books a year right now. Across the range. The majority of it is translation coming out of Chinese, and we are launching a new range of books right now, basically focusing on. There's 2 things we're focusing on. One is kind of kids lit, which we're kind of expanding into, and the other one is kind of traditionally we publish quite a lot of works from Sinophone, but from kind of the PRC, the People's Republic of China. Over the next while, we're going to expand that. We're going to expand into kind of what we call the Sinophone world, which is kind of anywhere where it's Chinese speaking, effectively. So that's Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore. That's kind of the diaspora communities, been both here in the UK and the States, and that's the trajectory of the publishing program, effectively.
Okay.
And,
well, that's really exciting as well, because so this project, we've got classics, contemporary, and young adult that we look at. So when you said children's, is it sort of like middle grade, or do you go into the young adult age group with where you're looking to expand?
The Sino Kids list is kind of, it took Sinoist Books about 5 years, effectively, 4 to 5 years, to kind of discover our feet and kind of get a good feel of where the publishing program is going to go to. So Sino Kids is very much in the same ballpark right now. We're in year 1 of it. So right now we're publishing everywhere from a YA book called My Sister's Red Shirt, which we just brought the translator over from the States over, Annalise Feingen. It's by an author called Tianing. And on the other end of the spectrum, we are doing kind of a series of like image books as well, kind of these beautiful artworks and kind of a sparse text kind of adapted into kind of a picture book type deal. And so I suspect, it'll take us a couple of years to really discover where that list will go. But we're very excited about it.
That is enormously exciting. And when you sometimes you kind of come up against your own sort of prejudices in that I think it hadn't occurred to me to think of how it would be interesting to read a children's book or a young adult book from China. But I mean, the home market there must be enormous for children's literature. So you can imagine it's really rich, and you're selecting from a huge range of possibilities. How do you pick?
It is a range. So my father has a philosophy degree he's never used, basically, because he exited university and went on to go manage with a degree in philosophy, and went on to manage a concrete factory. So it's contradictions and all that. But both my parents do quite a fair bit of reading, and so that's on one aspect of it. And inside China, domestically, we do have a wide range of like business partners and readers who we do trust. So that's kind of the second source of books. And the third source, really, it comes from translators, people we've been working with quite a while. They are really good advocates of literature and translation. And every time, like let's say Nikki or Jack Hargreaves or someone approaches us with a project, generally they've gone through it. Generally they've done their due diligence. So we're always kind of excited to see what kind of weird and wonderful things come from their direction.
Yeah.
And Roz and I were just talking about the number of translators on Old Kiln. And the question then is for you both about how it is to work with not one, but several translators. Was it 3?
This was
Is it
3. 3, yeah.
I think you better take this
Yeah,
one, David.
do I do that? Yeah, I won't go into great detail. Obviously, I wasn't involved in the translation. There were certain factors that led us down this route. One was the sheer size of the book and the time constraints we were working under. And also, there were certain positive aspects about multiple translators in terms of pooling one's ideas and coming up with an agreed approach. So at the outset, that's quite helpful. Down the line, it's obviously challenging because you've got different voices and different styles, and at least one of the translators is American, so there were cultural things there as well. So the challenge is really to try to have a coherent voice and just to try to make it read reasonably fluently across what the different translators have done. But as I say, it's not something I can talk a huge amount about the translation process, but it has its challenges.
But as
really well.
Yeah, sorry, Katja, you go on.
I was just saying it came across really well because I've read a book that was done by a translation collaborative, and it was so disjointed. I'll just name it. It's a Korean book called The Trunk. And I read it through and I thought, well, I like the premise, but I really struggled to find the main character to be consistent. I'm wondering if that's my mic sort of giving feedback, but this particular book, I was like, this feels really nice and smooth.
Yeah, I think a lot of that has to do. It goes to the author. I think it was, he has such a wonderful style. That it kind of makes it easy, and I think the translators love working on Jia Pingwa's books, and at least 2 of them, maybe 3, have worked on his books before, so they're familiar with his style. There are challenges with Jia Pingwa because he uses a lot of local dialect, I think, from his home province in Shanxi. So there's quite a bit of back and forth to really understand what he's getting at sometimes. So, but that's not something I'm party to. That's all done and dusted by the time I see it.
Well, I did wonder about that because as a reader, it was seamless. I had no sense of I'm moving between different voices, different translators. But I did, yes, have the impression that it was not dialect exactly, but but it was very much sort of they felt like rural villagers talking of a local version, and not a sort of high flown language, and that is a really challenging thing to convey for a translator. So I was very impressed, I suppose, that I got that feeling. I assumed that reflected the original.
Yeah, there's a bit of feedback I'm getting. I'm not picking up everything. Is anyone else picking that up?
Yeah, I tried unmuting my mic, but it's not my mic. So I've been going through everyone's and reducing them as sort of like background noise, but none of your mics responded to the reduction. So I'm unsure.
David, if you try muting yourself when you're not talking, I think it might be on your end.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, it
Okay,
was.
let's go.
Yep, we cracked it.
There it is.
Yeah.
Okay. So Tilly had said, it's really rewarding. The more you read, the more you're drawn in. I'm just limited by reading with a baby. So yeah, it's definitely one of the books that was the pace was going to be always a lot faster than any of the other books that we chose for this project. Our very first book was probably less than maybe a tenth or 15% the size of this book. So I think immediately it felt sort of a bit challenging, but the point was to actually really dive into a story that we hadn't experienced in the same way. And the sort of cultural revolution was something that I was interested in, because until then I had only actually read a very popular book called Wild Swans. And that was years ago. And I was like, I still don't know enough really about the Cultural Revolution. It would be interesting to have it from this perspective. But I was interested in the style, because the style really threw me. I think at first it took me a while to adjust to the nicknames, and then I really liked the nicknames. So is that something that's common to the authors? How do you say his name? Is it Jia Pingwa, or how do you pronounce his name?
Jia Pingwa.
So is that common to his writing style, to have those sort of nicknames for the characters and to have that this like otherworldly style mixed in? Because I know that it draws a lot on folk tales, and also our main character being able to, well, I'll let Roz, because we talked about this. Yeah, so the main character, Inkcap, being able to talk to the animals and everything. I was just curious if that's also something that you find in his other works.
David, you want to take this one? David, you're muted. You need to unmute yourself, David.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yep. Can you hear me? Okay. Yeah, there were the two questions there. I think one was the use of nicknames, and the other was Inkcap and I think his Gran have this ability to commune with nature, don't they? So the second one, yeah, that really, it really is. I think we've found it in just about every one of his books that we published in English. There's one book that he wrote, which is almost the same length as this one, called The Mountain Whisperer, which is a really weird title, and it's just full of mysticism and old folklore, and it is really very difficult book. So I don't really want to talk about that. But the other two we've done have elements of mysticism, but they don't really. They're not the most important part of the book, and they just play a sort of slightly interesting sort of side role. And I think that's the case with Old Kiln. So Inkcap would go out into the countryside and speak with the Swifts, and his mum, his gran, his adoptive gran, would do the same. And then there's of course Goodman up in his mountain retreat, who is a sort of peasant philosopher, and he has sort of draws on a lot of Chinese cultural history and religion in trying to cure the sick residents of Old Kiln. So there's definitely that thread in Old Kiln, but as I say, it doesn't really feel like a sort of a book of magic realism or anything like that to me. It's just an interesting sidebar.
Yeah, I think that magical realism was definitely a term that I didn't want to use about this book. That it's very realist. I mean, realist in the sense of you're getting very much that sort of the fascination of it is the day-to-day detail. The precise descriptions about how you thresh something, or how or which beaker you have to remove from this crop, or when you get to the kiln itself and the activities around that, and that level of realism is the thing that sort of stays with me from the book, and the talking to the animals or whatever just felt very natural. It didn't feel like, oh, now we're going a bit fantastic. It was a comfortable part of this rather realist book, which is, yeah, I'm really excited to hear that he uses that in his other novels, because it was one of the distinctive and appealing features of the book for me. But I was really interested in the character of Goodman and why he was there, and why we heard so much. Like, was he meant to be boring? I was asking myself. Or was he meant to be? He's kind of noble, but he's also like slightly irritating. You know, he's always going on again, you know. So I don't know about anyone else.
Yeah, he's a bit of a he's a bit of a goody-goody, isn't he? Sometimes you feel, and he's always, he doesn't seem to have a great sense of humour. But I think Jia Pingwa very much regarded him as the sole, good person of this novel. And I think he was kind of represented a lot of what the Cultural Revolution was designed to destroy. So as I say, religion, customs, old thinking, that was very much front and center of the old China that Mao wanted to get rid of. So he, despite all his good work, despite the fact that, the Cultural Revolution starts, but the villagers still have faith in him. If someone goes sick, he's the first person they turn to. So even though it's been drummed into them that these are feudal and old-fashioned attitudes, they haven't lost faith in him.
One of the themes of the book for me was that sort of the contrast between, or no, that you simultaneously have continuity over a long period, continuity of habits and behaviours and beliefs, and or continuity about rivalries and different families in the village, versus dramatic change, and it felt like that was a sort of key theme, something that he was trying to make sense of for us as readers that weren't there and haven't lived through that.
Yeah, I think one of the most interesting bits of things about the book is that it approaches it looks at the Cultural Revolution through the eyes of a village, a remote village in the countryside, miles from anywhere. And that's not something you see, certainly English language readers has probably come across before, because most of the books that address that decade are written from the perspective of city residents, the academics, the intellectuals who were persecuted and sent to the countryside. Obviously, it's the intelligentsia, the academics who are doing most of the writing. So it's perhaps not unusual that you don't get the voice of the villagers. But that's what sets it apart from the likes of Life and Death in Shanghai or Wild Swans, the sort of non-fiction titles. And there's that other book, Balzac and the Little Chinese Seamstress. Yes. Again, I think from the perspective of the city. But the great thing about this book is that it's seen through the perspective of this young boy, or this boy in cap, who was pretty much the same age as Jia Pingwa was when the Cultural Revolution started. So Jia Pingwa was 13 when it began. So I think he is sort of reliving his experience of the Cultural Revolution through this boy, and he just felt his presence everywhere throughout the writing of this book, which took about 3 or 4 years. He just felt it so strongly. At one point, he felt it was him, even though obviously there were very few biographical similarities between the two. So it's how did the Cultural Revolution reach this village when it was initiated in Beijing, thousands of miles away, whatever, and how did it impact a group of very poor peasants, as opposed to the usual suspects, the university lecturers and the teachers and the people with historical baggage in terms of being associated with Kuomintang. So I think that's what sets it apart, as I say, from the other titles that Western readers might be most familiar with.
Yeah, and going into the sort of like detail of the book, because we've kept it really nice and non-spoiler, but usually as we get to sort of like half an hour in, we can talk about some details. And I was really struck about, the enthusiasm of some people for addressing the four olds when it was the idea of going to smash their neighbors' items or sort of like try and pinch them. It was the most random things as well. I think there was was it a laundry stone or something that someone was trying to cart off and almost dropped on their foot. And, there's almost a little bit of humor in the most, like sad situations, because you're like, oh my gosh, I can barely wrap my head around it, but I can also very much believe it. So I found that sort of tone utterly absorbing, really, really compelling.
And I think what David was saying about, David, you're answering, but you're mute. So I started talking about, well, do you want to come in first?
I was just going to say, the reason I think the items became less and less impressive is because they're so poor, these people. They don't own much.
Yeah.
And it's ridiculous. Obviously, they should all, in theory, be benefiting from the Cultural Revolution, because the whole point of it was for the country to learn from the peasants. The educated youth were sent out to the countryside to learn the example of these small people from the countryside. And yet, what happens in the countryside is not that people benefit, but they tell on each other and they bicker and they argue about who's got more land or who owns more. So it becomes a really desperate situation. So and it ends up with these items of very low value being put forward as items that should be destroyed as part of the four old.
And I think what you were saying about seeing it through the eyes of Inkpap, who is, naive and young and not educated, not well informed, never, barely left his village, is that it almost makes the Cultural Revolution happen. It's almost like a natural phenomenon, a natural disaster that rolls in from somewhere else, like an epidemic or something, and then they take it up and get caught up in it, but they haven't really got a clue what it's all about, have they? So and that gave me a different, I suppose if you read a history book, you think things happen in an orderly way. Even something that's a revolution isn't disorderly and brutal. It's organized in how you hear about it, whereas this just sort of it's a mess, and then you realize, oh well, yeah, that's what it would have been like, if you lived in somewhere like that.
So talking about this whole mess that's happening in Old Kiln, we've got a question from Tilly, which is, how is it, let me show that. How is it as a publishing house to introduce things like the Cultural Revolution to English readers, given the lack of Chinese history in formal education that would be here? Does that affect book selection or marketing?
I think that one's for me. I would say very, very good question. I mean, I grew up in this country. Don't let my American accent deceive you. I very much grew up just in South London, actually. So I very much went through, the UK education system, right? And I would say I remember very clearly joining the UK education system, selecting my modules, finding a module on China. And one of the things that this module covered is essentially communist China, the Great Leap Forward, Cultural Revolution, and the 100th Hour campaign, right? And it's great that these things are covered, but that is pretty much the only exposure an English reader might have in a formal setting to China. You might hear the odd thing on the news every so often, but that very much then it doesn't inform like the complete picture, right? And it's like David said, I think the really interesting thing about this book is just how rural the coverage of this story is, because generally, you know, there is this conception, especially through the education, it's reinforced through the education, where the Cultural Revolution is seen as this thing where like the center basically started and dictated, and kind of Mao said, you know, go cause havoc under heaven, and the kids went out marching off, right? And that is certainly one aspect of it. It is an incredibly complicated event, and that's one aspect of it. But at the same time, what's less talked about is just, you know, it's angry young men kind of taking advantage of the times and then using that to either empower themselves or settle old scores. Your clan has wronged my clan way back when, and, you know, I am going to use this as an excuse to get even, sort of thing. And, you know, one of the things that really attracted us to this book, especially when we started working on it, I think back in 2017, is, doesn't that sound like the times we live in now, you know? And it's actually one of the most interesting things that during the marketing of this process, we got quite a fair amount of press coverage with it. I mean, from a back end point of view, we really started talking about this book to kind of journalists and whatnot pretty much as soon as David, you know, stopped working on it, which is, I would say, probably June last year. And one of the interesting thing is that journalists didn't really start engaging with this book until pretty much January of this year. And what happened in January of this year? The election of Donald Trump. And it's one of those weird things where it's like one of the reasons why we did so well in reviews wise is because people, like the journalists, basically used it as a chance for like a warning from the past, effectively. Like, it is something that like we are heading into right now, and it's something that is kind of unavoidable, I think, in a lot of respects, because certain things, events are already in motion that like can't really be stopped, which sounds like, again, like this book. And maybe, like, you know, the reason why they engage with it so much is, you know, is America heading into its own cultural revolution? Isn't that an interesting thing to think about? And it's, yeah, that's, no, which is not to say that we foresaw this 5 years ago when we decided to start working on this, but it's just the nature of the times, I guess. But yeah, it's one of those interesting little things that like I kind of always think about, because it's like, what actually causes a Chinese book to be successful in an English context isn't necessarily what the book originally was about. And it's and the kind of originals, the old kind of like, because these books are effectively the cream of the crop when it comes to Chinese literature. They resonated somewhere with the Chinese audience, right? But what resonated with the Chinese audience wouldn't necessarily resonate with an English audience. But that's not to say it can't discover its own context. So yeah, it's one of the kind of things about this job that's really interesting to me personally.
Yeah. Yeah, and a lot of that just resonates for me in terms of like reading it. Like I say, I'm 75% in. I've got part 5 left, which is called Winter, and things are really happening right now in the village. And up to this point, I was like, the poor women in this village, you know, like he talked at one stage about how the women used to work in the fields, they'd do their work, and they would, no matter what's going on with the men and with various, you know, factions, they'd have a bit of a joke. And at this stage that I've reached, they are very quiet when they're working together. And when I think it was Inkcap talks to someone, she said, "Oh, I daren't comment on that. I don't want to get, you know, I don't want to say the wrong thing and get reported." And the way that he wrote it was also, you know, like in the past, you know, at least if one of the women broke wind, they'd all have a bit of a giggle, and now they're just like they're so silent they daren't say anything. And what's playing out is all of these men in the different groups, sort of like, there's three, isn't there? There's, oh gosh, there's the red blades, there's the something hammers, there's, oh, I'm gonna miss the third one. Why can't I remember the third one? Anyway, there's the three factions. And then they're all like, oh, the reason that we've had to set this up is because of this family name people, you know, the people from this clan have been doing well. Did you not notice that? And so what you're talking about, that sort of, you know, like, I was like, yeah, that totally makes sense to me. And it is resonating. As someone who grew up in a totally different, you know, like environment and everything, there's still things in there that resonate for me. And especially when we're talking about the sort of like the role of the women, I'm like, okay, I can see a lot of this playing out at the moment, the sort of like misogyny and everything. But yeah, in different contexts. So I am finding it thoroughly compelling. I do want to get back to it almost immediately.
I think it's interesting what you were saying, Daniel, about like big picture, you know, Donald Trump's election, you know, that measure. But I think, but then when you come to read it, what sort of touched me, I suppose, or drew me in was, you know, that just people are do peoply things in the same way everywhere, and you know, if you look at you know, English history, you know, if you looked at the English Civil War and you go sort of into the detail, people did exactly the same thing of like, oh, we're going to settle old scores with each other, and you know, is this family would fall out, you know, and okay, so we'll use the fact that there's this big national event happening, but we're going to use it to settle our local rivalries, or you know, and you know, so it's got that universal quality as well.
Yeah. So talking about family history, that sort of like also sprang up for me while I'm reading a book that's set somewhere entirely different. My dad's family, they ended up on different sides of the wall in Germany. So he ended up with his mum in West Germany, and his dad and his sister, who had gone to visit family closer to Poland, they ended up, the wall obviously wasn't built overnight, but the barrier was, and they were not allowed to cross over. So they were stuck, and their future lives were therefore East Germany. So that's where his dad and his sister ended up. And he didn't see his sister from when they were preteens until they were both in their 50s. So yeah, a lot of what's actually in this book is making me think about, you know, like the ideologies and everything, and the fact that when I met my aunt, she talked to me about being a history teacher and how her entire experience was nullified because the history that she was permitted to teach in East Germany was no longer relevant now that there was a combined Germany. And that got me thinking about, you know, like what we are, what is the correct term? What is the permitted sort of like narrative, and who gets to tell their narrative, sort of thing. And
I'm guessing Jia Pingwa, he was able to write this book in, well, it was published 2016, I think, in China. Presumably it's not a book he could have written 15 years before, you know. There must have been shifts that enabled him to be able to write this now.
I would argue the book itself, I believe, first publication was published in 2010, I believe.
Oh,
and
right.
The nature of these things, especially with Old Kiln, is, well, Jia Pingwa is a prolific writer, but you know, it takes about 2 years, right, to publish, to write a book. So you know, it very much is, he started penning this thing around the kind of optimism of 2008, the Beijing Olympics, all of that sort of things. And, you know, it's interesting you say it can't be published 15 years ago. But before it was it can't have been published in the 90s, certainly. I mean, he was, Jia Pingwa was a censored author in the 90s. He couldn't have published anything. And I would probably argue that it's not publishable now, even. So it's a kind of a little bit of a time capsule, kind of permissibility, as it were, where like, you know, what is permitted to be kind of remembered and kind of talked about in a it's a context of where Chinese society was even 15 years ago. And it's one of those things where it's, I suspect personally, there been kind of bigger books about the Cultural Revolution written? Probably yes. But has it been written inside China domestically? Probably not. And would it be publishable by an author that's not Jia Pingwa? Probably not either. His unique kind of stature gives him the kind of, and the fact that what he chose to ground it on gave him a kind of unique platform to tell this story. And it is something that, like, I suspect it's as necessary to China today as it was back then. But perhaps the reason why it's finding success now internationally is because perhaps it's now relevant outside of China now as well. And it's one of those things where, you know, well, we hope with interest. Booker next year, yay, kind of thing.
David, do you want to come in?
When we get to the end, one of the pleasures is reading the afterword, and he writes afterwards from most of his books, I think, and he talks about how the Cultural Revolution is just a non-subject in China. Nobody discusses it. Nobody, well, perhaps they discuss it, but it's never on TV. It's never discussed officially, and he mentions speaking to his great nephews about it, and they've never heard of it. It's just airbrushed from history. And he at one point blamed himself. He said, I've been avoiding the subject myself. But he came to the realization, I think, was it 40 years after the end of the Cultural Revolution, that he describes memory as being like water, and for the passage of time, for all the sand and the silt to settle on the bed of the river, and he could finally see clearly enough to write about the subject. So while the timing was fortuitous, there's that little window that Daniel was talking about, he himself, I don't think, was ready to write about it. I think it was just too fresh in the memory, or too painful, or all sorts of reasons. He just couldn't see clearly enough to write until he'd approached his 50s. So everything just sort of came together that allowed him to publish it. Could it be published now, even with someone of his stature? I don't know.
Yeah. There was something he said in the afterword about people not being able to talk to each other about what happened then, because it's like you have to pretend it didn't happen, because if you did talk about it, you know, what would you do? You know, it's too awful. You know, you have to just sort of like bury your heads in the sand and pretend that you didn't, you know, accuse each other, or you know, and I think I found that actually I found reading the afterword really moving, as you say, for that reason. And I think, you know, any country that's been through, you know, a war, a revolution, you know, something like that, you know, it's the sort of, you know, the truth and reconciliation, you know, process that some countries go through, or you just sort of like, we'll just bury it and we won't write about it and we won't talk about it. Ooh. So another question from Tilly is really good. But
could you talk a little bit about the stature that Jia Pingwa has in China? Interested that you say he was previously censored, but now seems to be highly regarded.
So yeah, I think I can take this one as well. China is one of those authors. I think what not a lot of people realize about China is how incredibly decentralized this state is, basically. So he's from a province called Shanxi, and it's a capital. It's kind of provincial capital of Xi'an. He writes a lot both about the kind of rural countryside of Shanxi as well as the capital itself. It's roughly about 49 million people, I think, off the top of my head. So we're talking about like the population of Poland, effectively, and all of the kind of complexity that would entail, right? And inside Shanxi itself, he's kind of regarded as this kind of living legend, basically. In any event he does in Shanxi, pretty much, sells out stadiums, and he has people approaching him. There's one particular video I like to refer to is like he has a student from a university in Shanxi, basically, kind of going to him, kowtowing in front of him, and proclaiming him a god of literature, basically. And that's the kind of stature he has in Shanxi, which is not to say that he doesn't have national impact. He certainly does have national impact. He's probably one of the most regarded, well-regarded authors in China today. And it is the nature of China where, anything that like kind of floats to the top like him kind of gets grabbed by Beijing, basically, to come to Beijing, come to the center, and then kind of like, enjoy life and then kind of tell the story of China well. And he's unusual in the fact that he's never done that. He's always stayed in his own province. And that has a lot to do with kind of who he is and how and kind of where he grew up. But like, even with that, like he was famous from the kind of late 80s when my mother was growing up. And my mother was reading him as she was going through university. And, that, in the 90s, he wrote a book called, I believe, Ruined Capital, I believe, where essentially that was immediately after its publication, it was immediately censored. Too much kind of, let's just say, sex, drugs, and rock and roll for the censors alike. And but you could buy, like, one of the most famous examples is you could buy like his pirated manuscripts of that book was selling for like 50,000 RMB in Hong Kong and things of that nature. Just to give you an idea of what his readership is like. He somehow like this. He's one of those rare writers who's like achieve an escape velocity from the censors, right. And that essentially means that the censors has to let him back in eventually, and that was done, I think, in 2000. I want to say 4 or 5ish when he published a book called Shanxi Opera, which won the Maudlin, and which is pretty much essentially the highest literary award in China, pretty much China's equivalent of the Booker Prize, effectively. And that pretty much rehabilitated him in the eyes of the censors, and then he's been publishing ever since then, basically. And he publishes a wide variety. He generally doesn't. He's not an author that brings out the same book. Basically, he always talks about something different. So, like in the case of Broken Wings, like that was about like kind of bride kidnapping. In the case of To Soldier and Tea Shop, another book we've done of hers, it's about kind of the role of women and how the independence they've discovered in kind of modern China today. And then in Old Kiln, I think, is probably his most kind of dense work we've ever done in terms of kind of the philosophy behind it. But it's a collection of like 4 separate funerals linked by this one character called the Mountain Whisperer, which is imagine a celebrant, but like instead of talking at a funeral, he sings at a funeral. And kind of he's desperately trying to pass his craft on to an apprentice in between these 4 short stories. But you can see like the vast kind of changes China's undergone, like as he practices profession effectively. So yeah, he's not an author that like, he has incredible range, basically, and we're always kind of wondering. He has a quite rabid fan base in China domestically, always wondering where he'll take it next.
That's exciting. I mean, I am keen to read other books of his. At the moment, this one, I feel that the writing style is really nice and straightforward, despite there being, this ability to talk to animals, and we've got some folklore, and we've obviously got Goodman and the sort of like Taoism, Buddhism, old spiritual vibes coming in. It actually still feels very, very straightforward, no purple prose, direct, which I actually sometimes find difficult when he gets to the visceral bits, like involving animals, because there's a lot of animals that have really horrible fates in this book. Like there's dogs getting chewed up and beaten up, and cows getting beaten. There's a lot of beating of animals, and it really, really sort of like strikes me because it almost comes out of nowhere, because the writing is for a book this long, it's not like anything has been wasted. The words are not, like there's no like huge superfluous bits in there. It all serves a purpose. So writing style wise, I find it very exciting that he writes about something different, as you say, because I'd be keen to see how he writes about other things, hopefully not involving animal cruelty, that I can dive into.
What about the humans, Katja? There's a little bit of human
Oh, do you know what? I think at some stage, I don't know if it's just me, but at some stage, I think we all sort of accept that people can be really awful to one another. So I don't know. I haven't finished the winter chapter, so if it gets really bad, forgive me. But yeah, I haven't. At this stage, I'm kind of like, you know what? Yeah. Well, having said that, I think Half Stick really struck me, because that again just felt like it almost came out of nowhere, because we've got the escalation of her relationship with her husband, and then all of a sudden there's just like this throwaway commentary about how the sort of like sexual violence escalates for her, and I was like, oh, like. Yeah, so I think the writing style does, for me, work really well in unexpected ways.
So, in some ways, it's quite like for a book that is in places very violent. There's lots of very distressing violence in it. There's something understated about it. It's not an angry. It's not angry. It's not melodramatic. Things just happen, and get described, and that's what made it readable, I think, for me. Yeah. You never feel like you're being. The worst thing as a reader is when you feel like your emotions are being manipulated or you're being told what to think, and he absolutely doesn't do that, does he?
Do you know, it just struck me, I should probably ask David. So I'm saying that there was nothing superfluous. Did you have to cut tons of stuff? Is this down, because we always hear about when writers get successful, they have a lot of, or is it, like, I don't know. Did you have a lot of editing in that way to cut bits out, or?
David, you need to unmute yourself.
It really does. It's been published in the home language, and we treat it as a complete book. And we translate that work rather than going back and forth with the author. So not really. I think in terms of accessibility, we touched on it at the start. One of the things that made it relatively easy was the use of these nicknames, and we've used English nicknames. So there's no difficulty, which you often get in translated Chinese works, of trying to remember who is who, because there's not much to latch onto when you're dealing with a Chinese name, which could be male or female and doesn't have any associations or resonances. Here, just about everyone's got a nickname, so there's no problem of forgetting who is who.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. Or not like the problem with the Russian novel where everyone has about 4 names, because they've got their name and their patronymic and their nickname, and then so yeah, it was great. It was like that gave me a you're right, as an English reader, it gives you an easier route in.
That's right.
So just very quickly, because again, I haven't finished it, so I don't know what the fate of some of the characters is going to be. But it struck me a lot about the sort of like secretary, is it the party secretary of the Old Kiln, and how he was like on top of the world to start with, when the story actually felt almost sedate, like there's this whole setup happening. And then all of a sudden we have Bash, who was this sort of like loser on the outskirts, just, like womanizing and causing havoc, suddenly coming in to take the power. And how people who had been praised in the past was suddenly being vilified. And I found that also really fascinating in terms of how quickly, like things can change, like scenarios can change. And again, I do feel like these things are playing out in our modern times as well, in terms of things that we were really proud of having achieved. Suddenly, like, look at all this, nonsense. And yeah, so it spoke to me in that way as well, that things are almost cyclical, sadly. But I should ask other people's opinions, really, in terms of how you felt about the party secretary, and feel free to spoil it, because we are at 54 minutes. So I mean, at this stage we're allowed to talk about the details.
Do you need to unmute, David?
Oh,
yeah,
yep.
I was going to say, kind of feels overwhelmed, doesn't he, with all the new strictures coming to the village from Beijing, directly or indirectly, and he kind of gets overwhelmed by it. And he, various things happen to him, but he's he's had many years in a role of authority in the village, and he tries whatever he can to hold on to his power base, despite the revolution that's going on all around him. So that tussle between him and Bash and other people in the village is really fascinating.
I mean, he's a really interesting character, isn't he? Because he has taken advantage of his position, but he's also done his best. He's like kept things organised. Tried to be moderately fair and keep the whole system running and people getting fed. And I think he was surprisingly philosophical about his own downfall, shall we say, and that so he was one of the richest characters for me.
Yeah, he took
yes,
it in
he
his
is quite a
stride.
complex character, isn't he? Yeah, he's corrupt, and yet he does have a bit of decency about him, from what I remember. And he, as you say, he is in his own way doing what he thinks is best for the village as well as for himself.
Yeah, I was surprised at how well he actually took everything. So he ended up, trying to reassure Incap that actually, you know what, this work seems to suit me. When he was asked, are your ulcers acting up? How's your stomach? And he's like, I don't know, this it's actually all right. And it's almost like this whole weight of the old kiln has been taken off his shoulders, and he's just shoveling cow dung.
Yes.
Yeah. So we've got a lovely comment here from Katie. Thank you for this discussion. I am totally sold on the book and publisher, and have ordered the book from Blackwell's to be sent to Canada. I look forward to reading it. That's super.
Thank you, Katie.
And Tilly, I'm not at the end yet, but it struck me that Bash's character is really well drawn so far, including his relationship with Apricot and his manipulative techniques. So I can see him rising ruthlessly.
Mm-hmm. No spoilers, but yes.
You know what? As I was thinking about the book yesterday, I was just thinking how Dickensian it is in certain ways. I just, for Bash, you could read Bill Sykes and Apricot and Nancy, and then this orphan boy. I just thought, in terms of the characters, there were certain similarities with a Dickens epic.
Yeah, and like Dickens, he's not afraid to there's farcical moments and eccentricities. So he's sort of dealing with serious topics, but he's happy to throw in moments of ridiculousness or humor, but with a degree of compassion towards like all his characters, even when they're doing dreadful things. We're all human. Yeah. One last thing that I was thinking about what Daniel was saying about how valued he is in Shaanxi, is one of the things that I took from the book was a feeling of that this is a really strikingly beautiful place, or that the characters feel that it is. Their local mountain you know, they're really proud, and every now and then, you know, someone will suddenly stop and say, oh, but you know, it's looking so beautiful today, you know, and that was one of the striking qualities of the book. It makes sense to me when you say that he has a passion for where he comes from.
Yes,
Yeah,
also, the threads. Yeah.
Sorry, David, continue.
I was just going to say the book was quite environmental at certain points, wasn't it? I'm just remembering now. Up on the mountain there's this old tree which is greatly revered near where Goodman is hanging out, and I'm not sure when great things happen around the tree, perhaps near the end, but I won't spoil that. But there was just a sense of loss for the environment, the beauty, and the destruction of the environment. That's again in the background of this book.
Yeah, I enjoyed the whole idea of them having this village persimmon tree as well, where everyone's got their favorite area of the tree. Like the party secretary liked the ones all the way at the top, which of course is one of the scenes that I remember with Inkcap. I mean, Inkcap for me was quite the character. Even when at the start he seems to be more a character who's observing things. Towards the end, or rather at 75% where I am now, he's starting to feel more like a participant in things that are happening. Even one time being a little bit of an instigator, which you know, like his granny told him off about. But I found that really fascinating, that his role is slowly evolving, that we sort of like see things through his eyes at the start, and he is very much in the background, maybe listening to his gran to sort of like keep a low profile. But as the story is progressing, he is definitely becoming more involved, maybe because of his fascination as well with Bash, because he does sort of like really look up to Bash as a character in the village. And I think that's done very well as well. This sort of like increasing role for him, going from, I don't know how to describe it, but yeah. I don't know if that's the impression you had as well, Roz.
Yeah. Oh, he goes from someone, he's always there, and with his fuse to light, you know, like the pipe of the cigarette. But he's very marginal, and he's trying to get himself into a less, you know, Gran wants him to keep his head down and not get into trouble, but he's trying to, you know, like any teenager would, get himself in a less marginal position. Yeah.
So this might be a tiny bit of a spoiler, but I was so nervous when they burnt a certain book. Him and his gran burnt a certain book in their house as a solution to, you know, like, oh, you know what, we got this book wet and we don't want people to know about it, so we've sort of like hidden it. And then I'm like, well, that's even worse, you know, like destroying it even more. And then this knock comes and I was like, So I think it's just so cleverly done. Okay, we've got Amelia saying, couldn't make it earlier. Sorry, we'll watch the recording. That's okay, Amelia. That's lovely. So yeah.
And that's what many people do, although, you know, because it's a live show, you know, but it's UK time, but, you know, other people around, you know, in other places watch at different times, and that's a lovely thing. I'm conscious of the time, Katja. I don't know if you're watching the time, but
we're 2 minutes past
an hour
we usually go. Okay, so we will we'll wrap up because we have no questions in the comments. Thanks so much for everyone who commented. Tilly had some amazing comments in there. Katie, that's lovely to hear you getting the book. And Amelia, thanks for joining in at the end. And we'll log off now. Bye.
And thank you to David and Daniel. Thank you so much. It's been
Thank you so much for having us.
really interesting.
Thank you.